The Grand Senate Committee room fell silent as a tense stillness gripped the audience. At the center of it all, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett rose gracefully to her feet, her eyes glowing with fierce resolve. Just moments earlier, Senator Tim Scott had delivered what he believed was a knockout blow. With a smug smile, he accused Democrats of playing the race card whenever they lacked real arguments. To him, it was a clever, decisive move, one that would silence opposition and end the debate. But the next 30 seconds would shatter his confidence and set social media on fire. What was about to happen would dominate headlines for days and become one of the most savage political comebacks in recent history. Scott, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, leaned back with a self-satisfied smirk, convinced he had already won. Republican members of the committee nodded approvingly, some exchanging subtle grins. They believed the moment belonged to them, but Jasmine Crockett was not there to play defense. Not that day. Not ever. At 43, this former Texas defense attorney had faced bigger challenges than a condescending senator. Years of courtroom battles had sharpened her mind and her tongue. She knew how to spot a weak argument, how to dismantle it with precision. Scott, a 58-year-old South Carolina senator and the GOP's go-to spokesman on race, had spent over a decade dismissing claims of systemic racism. His entire brand rested on one narrative: if I can succeed as a black man in America, racism can't be that big of a problem. But Crockett was different. She wasn't from a political dynasty. She was a fighter who had clawed her way through law school, represented the powerless in hostile courtrooms, and built her career exposing injustice. She had faced prejudice, and won. The cameras rolled. C-SPAN broadcast live. The nation watched as Scott, with his trademark confidence, looked directly at Crockett and said the words that would change everything. Representative Crockett, I know it's hard for you to understand, but sometimes Democrats play the race card when they have nothing else. The room froze. Republicans smirked. Democrats held their breath. Staffers reached for their phones, ready to clip what they thought was Scott's moment of triumph. But Crockett stayed perfectly calm, like a lion waiting for the right second to strike. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the silence like a blade. Senator Scott, I find it fascinating that you think you have the moral authority to lecture me about playing the race card, when your entire career has been built on shielding the Republican Party from accusations of racism. The smirks on the Republican side began to fade. Tell me, Senator, what tangible actions have you taken for Black Americans? Which bills have you fought for? What systemic changes have you championed? Scott opened his mouth, but no answer came. Let's be honest about the card you've been playing, Crockett continued, her tone sharpening. The I made it, so racism must not exist card. The room went dead silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers stopped. Scott's confident smile wavered. Crockett leaned forward. You sit there in your expensive suit, collecting your government paycheck, and you have the audacity to tell Black Americans that racism no longer exists. You dismiss the lived experiences of millions who face discrimination every single day. Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably. Scott's posture slumped. Senator, during your decade in Congress, can you name one significant law you authored that directly improved the lives of Black Americans? Pause. I'll wait. The silence stretched. Scott struggled to respond, his lips moving but no words coming out. That's what I thought, Crockett said coolly. Her attack only intensified. Here's what your record shows. You voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You opposed pandemic relief for communities of color. You voted against the Equality Act. You rejected every major police reform bill. You blocked healthcare and education measures that would have lifted black communities. Each fact hit like a hammer. Scott visibly sank lower in his chair when he finally tried to defend himself. Crockett cut him off with the precision of a trial lawyer. These votes weren't complicated. Either you supported protecting voting rights or you didn't. Either you stood with struggling communities or you didn't. There's no context that excuses those choices. Then Crockett shifted from facts to something deeper. Her voice softened but grew even more powerful. Let me tell you what playing the race card really looks like. As a child, I was followed in stores because they assumed I might steal. In law school, despite top grades, I was told I only got in because of affirmative action. In courtrooms, I had to change my voice and mannerisms just to be taken seriously. I've worked twice as hard as my white colleagues for the same opportunities. These aren't political talking points, Senator. These are my lived experiences. The room went still. Even Republican staffers who had been smirking moments earlier fell silent. I don't call that playing the race card, Crockett said, locking eyes with Scott. I call that reality. Scott looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. The once confident senator now seemed small and cornered. Crockett delivered her final blow. So tell me again, Senator, how exactly do I not understand these issues? Or maybe the truth is simpler. You've been playing a different card all along. The sellout card. Republicans erupted in protest, demanding her words be struck from the record. But it was too late. The damage was done. The clip would explode online, replayed millions of times as one of the most legendary takedowns in congressional history. Closing hook that day, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She exposed the hypocrisy, the arrogance, and the dangerous narratives that try to erase the lived reality of racism in America. Her courage turned a routine committee hearing into a historic moment of truther, moment that proved facts and fearlessness can still cut through political theater. Asterisk, when Jasmine Crockett entered Congress, her reputation spread rapidly as a fierce advocate who refused to back down from a fight. Unlike some Democrats who preferred a more conciliatory, soft-spoken approach, Crockett believed in confronting issues, head and fighting, fire with fire whenever necessary. She had already clashed with Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican notorious for her controversial remarks, and called out Greene's racist comments with surgical precision and unflinching honesty. Yet, despite her willingness to confront and challenge opponents, the coming showdown with Senator Tim Scott carried a fundamentally different weight, different in tone, significance, and underlying tensions. This was not merely another committee exchange. It was a collision of resilience, lived experience, and a refusal to be silenced. Meeting Scott's self-assurance and often patronizing attitude head-on, what unfolded would be about far more than words. It became a confrontation loaded with deeper implications about race, power, and identity in contemporary America. This was no simple disagreement over policy. It grew intensely personal, reaching into the core of what it means to discuss race and representation in the United States. For years, Tim Scott had systematically dismissed the authentic experiences of Black Americans, particularly Black women, whose voices and struggles he frequently minimized or outright ignored. His persistent efforts to downplay their realities fostered deep frustration and outrage among those who believed that such dismissiveness could no longer go unchallenged for Crockett. The moment inside that committee room marked a breaking point, a clear assertion that what was happening transcended routine political sparring. This was a direct challenge to the very integrity of America's conversation on race. It was not merely a debate about legislation, but a profound struggle over narrative. Who has the right to speak? Whose experiences are validated? And whether figures like Tim Scott could continue to distort and gaslight an entire community about their lived realities. Scott entered the chamber armed with his usual tactics. He dismissed concerns about systemic racism, claimed Democrats exploited racial issues for political gain, and presented himself as the calm, reasonable voice in a sea of chaos. Such strategies had served him well many times before, allowing him to walk away from confrontations appearing balanced and moderate. But for Crockett, this encounter was never about political theater. It was about defending the dignity and truth of every black individual who had ever been told that their suffering was a lie, their pain an overreaction, or their experiences invalid. It was about standing in solidarity with black women who had been dismissed by men who looked like them but refused to stand up for their interests. It was about resisting the persistent gaslighting of politicians who claimed to speak for black communities while actively undermining their struggles. The committee had convened to discuss voting rights legislation, but the session quickly dissolved into a broader, more urgent debate about America's ongoing racial struggles. During his remarks, Scott accused Democrats of weaponizing race for political advantage, asserting that the era of widespread systemic racism was over, and that such claims were merely political tools. Then came his critical miscalculation, the moment that would define the encounter. Fixing his gaze on Crockett with a patronizing smile, Scott delivered his line, his tone dripping with condescension. "Representative Crockett, I know it's hard for you to understand, but sometimes Democrats play the race card when they have nothing else." The room fell silent. Republican committee members smirked knowingly, while Democratic staffers held their breath, sensing the impending confrontation. Cameras zoomed in on Crockett's face, capturing her poised expression as she prepared to respond. At that instant, Tim Scott had crossed a line that everyone in the room recognized as pivotal. As the last word left Scott's mouth, the atmosphere shifted. On the Republican side, members exchanged glances, pleased with what they assumed was a political masterstroke, condescending enough to put Crockett in her place, yet wrapped in careful language to avoid outright backlash. Conservative staffers reached for their phones, eager to record Scott's supposed triumph for social media. Scott leaned comfortably back in his chair, a smug smile widening across his face as he basked in what he believed was an easy victory. This tactic was not new to him. Scott had deployed it repeatedly against other black Democrats, and it had almost always worked. His status as the Republican Party's token black senator, combined with his readiness to gaslight colleagues about the reality of racism, had rendered him nearly untouchable in such exchanges. Behind the confident veneer, however, Scott was relying on a familiar playbook, one designed to dismiss black voices while maintaining a facade of moderation. Republican committee members were already preparing the talking points for upcoming press conferences, convinced that Scott had delivered another masterclass in political maneuvering. The senator from South Carolina appeared fully immersed in the moment, savoring what he assumed was a straightforward victory over a rookie Democrat whom he believed lacked the experience or backbone to challenge him effectively. But as Scott's gaze swept across the table toward Jasmine Crockett, a warning should have stirred in his mind. There was something about her demeanor that diverged sharply from what he had come to expect from previous opponents. Her face remained composed, passive, almost serene, with none of the irritation or anger that usually flared in rivals when cornered. Instead, Crockett stared back with the calm, methodical focus of a seasoned defense attorney who has just discovered a fatal flaw in the prosecution's case. Her hands rested neatly folded before her, exuding quiet control and intensity. There was an almost predatory quality to her stillness, like a lion locking eyes on unsuspecting prey, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. Crockett did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When she finally spoke, her words cut through the room like a scalpel. "Senator Scott," she began, her tone steady and deliberate, "I find it fascinating that you believe you have the moral authority to lecture me about playing the race card when, reality, you have constructed your entire career around being the Republican Party's shield against accusations of racial discrimination." The smirks began to fade from Republican faces. This was not the response they had anticipated. For years, whenever their party faced criticism for racist policies or actions, they would rally around Scott or similar figures, claiming, "See, we can't be racist. We have Tim Scott." But Crockett was challenging that narrative directly. She pressed further. "What tangible actions have you taken for Black Americans? Which bills have you championed? What systemic changes have you fought tirelessly to implement?" Scott's smirk faltered. Her words struck a nerve. He tried to interrupt Representative, "If I may," but Crockett was already in command. Her courtroom-honed skills were on full display as she steered the room with surgical control. "If you want to talk about playing cards," she continued, her voice sharpening, "let's be honest about the one you've been holding your entire career, the "I made it, so racism must not exist" card." The room fell into a heavy silence. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased as everyone sensed the significance of what was unfolding. Scott's earlier confidence began to crack. He had expected Crockett to respond defensively, perhaps to justify her position or deflect. Instead, she had gone on the offensive, striking at the core of his political identity. "You sit there in your expensive suits, collecting a government paycheck," Crockett went on, her tone unwavering, "and yet you have the audacity to tell Black Americans that racism no longer exists. You dismiss the lived experiences of millions who face discrimination every single day, experiences that continue to shape their reality and opportunities." Discomfort rippled across the committee. Members shifted uneasily in their seats, avoiding eye contact. The room was no longer a stage for routine political sparring. It had become the setting for a profound confrontation that exposed the stark divisions and contradictions of the current political landscape. Crockett's steady stance turned the tide, revealing an uncomfortable truth that even those on the Republican side could no longer ignore. The debate about race, discrimination, and equality was far from settled, and her words had struck a nerve that demanded acknowledgement. Observers turned toward Scott, expecting him to recover and reassert himself, but he appeared almost paralyzed, caught off guard by the intensity and precision of Crockett's challenge. Then Crockett leaned slightly forward, her voice measured but piercing. "Let me share something with you, Senator. I've spent years as a defense attorney. I've represented countless Black clients harassed by police, denied loans because of their skin color, and discriminated against in employment. But judging by your words, I suppose you believe all of those struggles were simply attempts to play the race card right. Rather than de-escalate, Scott made a second critical misstep. Ego overpowered caution. He attempted to regain his condescending tone. "Representative Crockett," he said, forcing a confident smile, "I believe your inexperience is showing. I've been in Congress longer than you've been in politics. My understanding of these issues surpasses that of someone who's only recently entered the arena." The instant those words escaped, Crockett's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of steel in her eyes. If Scott had studied her background more closely, he would have known that questioning her experience was the worst possible move. "My inexperience," she echoed, her voice suddenly colder, sharper. "Senator, let me tell you what experience truly means." The chamber grew still. Crockett had set a trap, and Scott had walked directly into it. "If you want to talk about experience," she said, leaning forward, "let's turn the spotlight on you. During your more than a decade in Congress, can you name a single significant piece of legislation that you authored, a law that directly and meaningfully benefited Black Americans?" Scott opened his mouth, perhaps to respond, but Crockett was far from finished. "I'll wait," she said calmly, leaning back in her chair with the patience of someone who already knew the answer. The silence stretched on, feeling like an eternity as Scott's lips moved uselessly. Unable to form a coherent response, like a fish flopping helplessly on dry land, gasping for air that would not come. Around the chamber, Republican committee members exchanged nervous glances, their confidence slipping away. Some stared down at their phones, as if frantically searching for a fact or a line that might rescue their colleague from the trap he had walked into. The air was thick with anticipation and discomfort, the kind of charged stillness that exposes weakness more brutally than any shouted accusation. Finally, Crockett broke the unbearable quiet with a remark so quiet it felt like a blade sliding between armor plates. "That's what I thought," she said, her voice calm but decisive. "But let me make one thing clear about your experience. Senator," she paused just long enough to ensure every eye was on her, "I know that you have voted against every major piece of voting legislation that has come before this Congress. I know that you opposed measures aimed at police reform. And I know that you have consistently voted against expanding access to healthcare, education, and economic opportunity policies that would have disproportionately benefited Black communities." Each sentence landed like a hammer blow. Scott's carefully cultivated confidence evaporated. His shoulders sagged under the weight of her relentless critique, the smug half-smile replaced by a tight, uneasy grimace. "So," Crockett continued, her tone still steady, "please tell me again how I don't understand these issues. Tell me again how Democrats are merely playing the race card for political gain." Her words echoed through the chamber, a sharp reminder of the contrast between her meticulous preparation and his hollow bravado. Then she delivered the line that detonated like a political grenade. "From my perspective, Senator, it looks a lot less like we are playing a race card, and a lot more like you have been playing the sellout card." The word sellout exploded in the air, its impact immediate and undeniable. Republican members leapt to their feet, voices rising in indignant protest as they demanded that the remark be stricken from the record. The chairman's gavel hammered for order. Democratic staffers tried to hide their smirks behind folders and hands, their eyes bright with barely contained amusement. Yet for all the noise, all the procedural outrage, every gaze returned inevitably to the man at the center of the storm, Tim Scott. Moments ago, he had entered the confrontation sure of victory, believing himself the hunter. Now he was unmistakably the hunted, cornered, and exposed. His face betrayed a flicker of panic as he realized the balance of power had shifted beyond his control. Representative Crockett. "Your comments are out of order," the chairman barked, pounding his gavel. But Crockett, a woman long accustomed to being told to stay quiet, was unmoved. Years of courtroom battles had hardened her resolve. "Mr. Chairman," she replied with cool defiance. "I withdraw the word sellout." A pause. Then, with a sly glint of mock politeness, "Allow me to rephrase. Senator Scott has been playing the 'I got mine, so everyone else should stop complaining' card." Gasps rippled across the room. Scott attempted a rebuttal. "Representative, you're putting words in my mouth," but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I, Senator?" Crockett shot back, reaching deliberately into her folder. From it, she drew a thick stack of papers and held them high for the cameras to see. "Because I have your voting record right here." A murmur swept through the chamber. What came next would be remembered as one of the most methodical and devastating takedowns in congressional history, with the controlled authority of a seasoned attorney presenting evidence to a jury. Crockett began to read. "In 2021, you voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. In 2020, you opposed the HEROES Act, which sought vital pandemic relief for communities of color hit hardest by COVID-19. And in 2019, you voted against the Equality Act." Each citation struck like a precision strike. Scott's posture collapsed fraction by fraction, his shoulders sinking as though the sheer weight of the evidence pressed him physically into his chair. What was supposed to be a routine sparring, a chance for the senator to deliver his familiar talking points about race and democratic gamesmanship, had transformed into a full-scale rout. He tried to interject, but Crockett's courtroom instincts held firm. Years of litigation had taught her to control a room, and she maintained that dominance now with calm, relentless focus. "These votes were not complicated," she said crisply. "Either you supported protecting voting rights, or you didn't. Either you stood with communities suffering during a pandemic, or you didn't. There is no nuance that changes those facts." But Crockett was not finished. What followed carried a weight beyond legislative roll calls. It was personal, lived, and undeniable. "You talk about the race card," she said, fixing Scott with an unwavering stare. "Let me tell you what that really looks like." She described being followed in stores as a child, suspected of theft for no reason other than the color of her skin. She recalled law school classmates, students with lower grades and less rigorous resumes who sneered that she was there only because of affirmative action. She spoke of working twice as hard as her white peers to earn half the recognition, of enduring racist jokes in professional settings, of having to change her voice and mannerisms in courtrooms simply to be taken seriously. The room fell silent again. But this silence was different, heavier, more intimate. Even Republican members who had been whispering among themselves stopped to listen. These were not statistics or sound bites. They were lived experiences, raw and unassailable. And yet, she continued, her voice gaining quiet strength, "I have never called those struggles a card to be played. They are not tactics. They are reality, my reality, and the reality of millions of Black Americans who cannot simply decide to ignore racism because it is inconvenient." Scott, visibly unsettled, dropped his gaze to the table. For once, he could not meet her eyes. Then Crockett delivered the line that would reverberate far beyond the committee room. "Senator Scott," she said, her tone sharpening to a scalpel's edge, Do you want to know the difference between us? When racism affected my life, I fought back. When racism advanced your career, you profited from the reaction. The impact was electric. Democrats exchanged wide-eyed glances. Republicans erupted in shouts, demanding order and apologies. The chairman's gavel pounded like a drumbeat against the chaos, but Tim Scott sat frozen, stunned into silence. The man famous for always having a polished retort now found himself speechless, sidily stripped of the rhetorical armor that had long protected him. He tried haltingly to defend himself. I have dedicated my life to public service, but Crockett cut him off with surgical precision. Public service is not a shield, Senator. Being the Republican Party's token black voice is not a legacy. It's a strategy, and a damaging one. Scott recoiled, visibly shaken. If he thought the exchange had reached its climax, he was mistaken. Crockett turned deliberately toward the cameras broadcasting live on CC, locking eyes with the millions watching across the country. She spoke directly into the lens. "Senator," she said, her voice steady but charged, "I want you to look at these cameras. I want you to look at the black Americans watching this hearing. And then I want you to explain to them why you have spent your career telling them their experiences with racism are not real." The chamber went deathly quiet. Scott's eyes flicked toward the cameras, then darted away, unable to hold the gaze. "I want you," Crockett pressed on, "to look at the black mothers who have buried their children because of police violence and tell them they are simply playing the race card. Look at the black workers denied promotions solely because of their skin color and tell them they are imagining things." Her words hung in the still air like a thunderclap. Scott opened his mouth, searching for something, anything to say. But nothing came. The man who prided himself on always having an answer sat mute, his silence louder than any protest. For a long, breathtaking moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the cameras capturing history in real time. Confrontation that exposed not just one senator's record, but the deeper struggle over race, power, and truth in America.